barbarity and military failure of the Israeli regime. We're talking about a regime that's very sophisticated in terms of its weaponry, in terms of its surveillance technologies. But not only that, it boasts to have eyes and ears everywhere, especially, spies embedded in Palestinian communities. And whilst a lot of that is true, it's clear that the Israeli regime, to a large extent, manages to oppress and dominate Palestinians on the basis of this idea that it's all-seeing and all-knowing. And I think this latest operation by Hamas fighters really smashes that idea. It completely obliterates it. And what everyone's asking, including Israelis themselves, is how could they have planned this and executed this in a highly surveilled open-air prison that is Gaza? And we know even now, it's very clear that the Israelis were completely caught off guard. They were not even in the slightest bit expecting this. And I think it was that element of surprise accompanied with guerrilla tactics that we haven't seen before is that what has allowed this operation to go on for so long.
In the West, the dominant narrative is that this is, barbaric terrorism, and obviously lots of unarmed civilians have been killed, which is awful to witness. What's the response though been from Palestinians? Is there any sort of disgust at what's happened, or is it pretty much all saying this was legitimate resistance and we've been subjugated for way too long?
No, I think it's mixed on many fronts, and I don't think we can say that all Palestinians feel the same. We're not a homogenous body, but I think with any kind of operation, for many people there is a feeling of dread and deep anxiety, because we know that there will be reprisals, and we've seen already that the Israeli regime's reaction has been brutal. The bombardments of Gaza have been indiscriminate. They've been killing hundreds, in several cases wiping out entire families. But I think it's important as well to remember that, the Palestinian people are people that have nothing left to lose. The worst has already happened, and it continues to happen. And I've seen, commentators say, how could they do such a thing when they know that the response will be brutal, even framing this as an unprovoked attack. But this completely obscures the reality of what Palestinians in Gaza and throughout the rest of colonized Palestine have been living through. But in particular in Gaza, we're talking, over 17 years or 16 years of this brutal military siege, which has rendered it essentially in an open-air prison. This is a population of 2 million people, that most of whom are already refugees, and it's hardly anyone goes in, goes out. Goods and electricity is severely restricted. All of this, I'm sure many of your listeners know. And they've been subjected to so many bombardments over the years. Thousands of Palestinians have been killed, hundreds of thousands injured. And so, this, I think for many Palestinians, we're at the end of our tether here. This isn't about armed resistance. Palestinians are not allowed to resist in any way, shape or form. Palestinians historically and continuously use a whole host of non-armed resistance tactics. The BDS movement, for example, which is successively being criminalized around the Western world, including the UK. Let's not forget 5 years ago, specifically in Gaza, Palestinians marched to the Israeli fence that has caged them in, and they demanded their freedom and the right to return to their lands. They were unarmed and they were gunned down in front of the international media for weeks on end. There is just simply no right way for Palestinians to resist Israeli colonial occupation. We're supposed to lie down and quietly be erased from history.
You've talked about these attacks, potentially as sort of an act of desperation. There's nothing left to lose. Is there any sort of possible future whereby these do lead to some kind of positive outcome somewhere for Palestinians? Or, is this sort of a hopeless scream of despair? What's your sort of take there?
I think it's a bit too soon to sort of analyse, what the end game really is for this particular operation by Hamas. A huge number of Israelis were taken captive. Some have actually been killed in the Israeli bombardments, at least 4, I think now. But we know from precedents that this can actually be leveraged to release Palestinian political prisoners. So, for example, in 2006, Gilad Shalit, an Israeli soldier, was captured by Hamas. and he was eventually exchanged for over 1,000 Palestinian political prisoners. We're talking one Israeli captured soldier for 1,000 Palestinians. And at the moment, there are 4,500 Palestinian political prisoners. So that's definitely one aspect of this, that there have been talks about a prison exchange, but it's kind of been overwhelmed by the Israeli bombardment. And I think there's also a territorial aspect. This is the first time in history that any Palestinian group has reclaimed land taken from them in 1948. So even, if it is for a short amount of time, that's quite significant. And I think there's also, a power play by Hamas in terms of internal Palestinian politics. But as I said, the situation is still unfolding. We're not sure what this is going to lead to. There is an all-out siege being imposed on Gaza, an all-out bombardment, and we're very anxious to see what's going to happen in the rest of colonized Palestine. So I think there's still a lot to be said, as things unfold.
Something that's dominated the debate in Britain and, I assume across the West is sort of this idea of morality and moralizing what's gone on. And I suppose the most obvious take to have if you're sort of on the left is to say, and I think this is probably my position, is to say, armed resistance is always legitimate for an occupied force, but at the same time, targeting civilians is a war crime. How would you respond to that? How do you think people on the left in the UK should approach what's happened over the past few days? Because I feel like people are sort of struggling as to sort of how to express their solidarity with Palestinian people without seeming to sort of cheerlead, killing lots of people at a music festival. I mean, do you have any sort of thoughts on that?
I mean, I think, as I said, Palestinians, really, whatever resistance they do, it's always going to be criminalized and demonized. So I think we have to reframe what we're talking about and always contextualize what we're talking about, in particular when it comes to Gaza. Palestinians in Gaza are living in an open air prison. Palestinians, when they undertake unarmed resistance tactics, they're also demonized, criminalized as terrorists, as anti-Semites. So, I think that we have to take a really long, hard look and think about the framing of these things. There is obvious, anti-Palestinianism at work. We're seeing that in the Western media narrative, how they're talking about all of this. There is a complete lack of context. It's as if Palestinians out of nowhere, have this bloodthirsty appetite. There's no discussion of colonization, of military occupation. This was not an unprovoked attack. I think that's crucial that we talk about that. There's nothing unprovoked in the situation when you have, people under colonial occupation for decades, and in Gaza under military siege. And I think that context is incredibly important when talking about what's going on right now.
I don't want to ask you to sort of predict the future, but I mean, do you have any idea or sort of any sense of how far the Israelis might go in their reprisals and what that might look like? I mean, we're going to see significant bombing of Gaza. We already have. Will there be a ground invasion? And then there's also the question of how might this impact Palestinians in the occupied West Bank or in East Jerusalem?
Well, I'm not sure if you can tell, but I'm incredibly anxious and stressed because I think, it's going to get really, really bad. We're not sure exactly what lies in store for Palestinians in Gaza and also in the West Bank, but we know it's going to be bad. The Israeli Defense Minister has already stated that they've imposed a complete siege on Gaza, meaning that they've cut off the power supply, the water supply, no food is going in whatsoever. And these are people that are in an open air prison. They have nowhere to go. In the West Bank, the situation is incredibly tense. People are panic buying food. They've closed all the checkpoints. And need I remind you that, the West Bank is divided up into all these areas that are basically can be closed off by the Israeli army at any point in time. And that's what they've done. There are settlers on the roads shooting Palestinians. There have been several Palestinians already killed in the West Bank. And of course, there is no mention of that. So there's very little movement right now, and Palestinians are very scared and very anxious.
I'd like to get you to talk about the international response, because I mean, from the EU, from the United States, from the UK, we've basically seen, suggestions of unconditional solidarity for Israel. Israel has a right to defend herself, in the words of Keir Starmer, sort of gendering Israel for some strange reason. And we've also got sort of Israeli flags being projected onto public buildings across much of Europe. British public buildings have been encouraged to raise the Israeli flag. I mean, how would you respond to those sort of expressions of solidarity with Israel?
If I'm very honest with you, it's disgusting, but not off-brand at all. You know, the British government has consistently been an ally to the Israeli regime and its colonization of Palestine right from the very beginning. And I'm afraid across the political spectrum, the Labour Party was historically the most avid supporter of the Zionist project in Palestine. And certainly today it seems to be living up to that legacy. You know, and essentially, you know, I don't think this is about the UK showing solidarity. Well, I should say the British government showing solidarity with those who have lost loved ones. This is the UK once again showing where it stands in a situation of colonization and apartheid. And once again, it's falling on the wrong side of history. So I think there's, you know, no surprise there whatsoever. But it's quite phenomenal how brazen it is, the double standards and the hypocrisy. You know, not long ago, we were seeing the Ukrainian flag being flown all over the place, all over social media, on British government buildings, in support of a people resisting resisting occupation. And now we have, you know, the roles reversed completely, where the British government is supporting a colonizer and an occupier. But again, as I said, you know, this is not off-brand.